I'm Dr. Gerald Auger with Simply Cyber and your host for today's panel. I've been practicing information security for 20 years. I teach in the Citadel Military College Cyber Sciences, and I love open discourse around cybersecurity industry topics just like today. So what are we talking about today? The topic is cybersecurity, new regulations, and why you should care. The Federal Trade Commission, commonly known as the FTC, is founded to protect consumer information, and they have outlined a number of parameters that companies will need to adhere by June 9th. Now, you might think, well, I'm not a financial institution. It doesn't apply to me, right? Well, upon closer inspection, you'll see that regulations in the recently expanded safeguards rule will affect a host of sectors. Why? Because the FTC's definition of a financial institution includes any organization that is handling customer financial data, right? So banks, obviously, but what about academic institutions? Yep. Car dealerships? Yep. You will be surprised who and what is in scope for this regulation. And perhaps you're tuning in from outside the United States. What precedents do standards like the FTC's set for the rest of the world? It will be interesting to see what the future will bring. Now, joining us today is an impressive panel of experts on cybersecurity, each of them with a different perspective to bring to help shed light on this important topic. Now, if you have any questions during the show, please type them into the chat window and we'll do our best to get them answered on stage by our panelists. Now, allow me to introduce these four gentlemen to my side here. Starting at the top right, we've got Chad Johnson, Cybersecurity Advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, commonly known as CISA. Directly next to him, Dan Didier. He's the VP of Solutions at GreyCastle Security. Beneath him, my good friend Forrest Pace, Cyber Practice Leader with Brightline Insurance. And rounding out the panel is Heath Spencer, the CEO at TraitWare. I'm super pumped to have you guys here today. Thank you for taking the time. So let's kick this. Yeah, absolutely. Let's kick this off with Dan, right, Dan? You advise companies on best practices for security all the time. What are some of the biggest surprises in terms of companies or organizations who might be affected by this FTC regulation and don't even know about it yet?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the first thing I'll say is I think the regulation is very reasonable in its approach. And one of the big surprises is right where they start out, the big blurb says step one is conduct a risk assessment and understand what your unique risks are. So first problem is this isn't just a checklist scenario of things you can go through. You actually have to understand how your practices, the information you're collecting, your technology, and your people introduce risk to what you said earlier, protecting that consumer information. And then from that, the FTC expects you to build reasonable controls and mitigate issues that you've identified, and you have to write it all down, right? Why? So there's a written plan, there's a record, and then you can show progress with a corrective action plan. So really, in my experience, that's really the biggest surprise is, so how do we do that is the next question. And that's really where the hard work starts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to throw it to Chad. Chad, your thoughts on, what are the goals of this kind of initiative and how does CISA get involved with determining guidelines around, kind of implementing these things and doing these best practices?
Yeah, sure. So first, let me say, everything we put out is voluntary, right? We don't have the authority to tell any organization that they have to do this or have to do that. So recently, we put out what we call the cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals. That cross-sector being key, they are the baseline of things that every organization should do. While critical infrastructure is in the name, it really applies to every organization out there. This is the baseline, right? That's not the end goal, but this is the baseline that that organizations should be doing. And really, what that is we were looking to create a voluntary adoption of different cyber practices, that's going to make the American people feel better about what they should expect, security-wise for critical infrastructure, those things that, the oils, the gas, the finances, transportation, if they were to go down, it's going to have a big impact on the community. So while we put that out, we've also got a checklist that's on our website that goes along with that goes over this whole baseline of things. And kind of the nice thing about it is they've prioritized it by the cost. What does it cost the organization to implement this specific area? what's going to be the impact, how complex is it, and it's actually, so the checklist is about 13 pages long, but it's, it's got, again, it's the things that most people hear and you're like, oh yeah, well, that's what, that's the basics, just asset inventories, your vulnerability management, logging, having those logs so you can do those things. So really it's about creating that baseline. It is not meant to replace any guidance out there. Again, because it's all voluntary, so we wouldn't be replacing, but we generally map most things to the NIST cybersecurity framework. So that's what we're looking for, is to provide guidance. We can't force you to do it, but it's there to help create that baseline.
I love it. Forrest, I wanted to get your, I love the insurance industry for many, many reasons and what it's done for cybersecurity. But Dan's talking about businesses need to have risk assessments, and Chad's talking about how basically CISA provides all sorts of resources that they can implement, yet a lot of businesses have challenges. How are you seeing this regulation driving the market, or how are you seeing it from an insurance perspective on how it's going to help or hurt some of these businesses?
Yeah, I think what it is really doing is requiring a lot of businesses to grow up, quite frankly. And it's a good source of growth, right? We live in a digital age where, Chad mentioned the asset inventory and the logs, and why that is important is because, the age-old concept in insurance is we're covering what is in your care, custody, and control. Well, that same principle applies to both endpoints and data. And so knowing where your assets are and what information is where, it doesn't particularly matter that a third-party vendor is maybe doing analytics on that data. It is still your data. And so I think the insurance industry has done, some will say a good job, some will say a bad job, but they've really been kind of the private sector stick as opposed to the carrot on really enforcing stronger requirements and controls around this. And a lot of it is not as difficult or expensive as I think it is often construed to be. But really, it's about the people and the processes. I'd like to lead off by saying there is no silver bullet. There are really good measures and technologies to deploy, but it still relies on the people and the processes in place. And so I think insurance does a really good job of understanding, I guess, zooming out at the enterprise level and making it not just a technology risk, but a broader enterprise and organizational risk when you factor in all the different facets of it.
Yeah, and speaking of like best practices and not being overly complex, but there is no silver bullet. Heath, TraitWare is innovating in cybersecurity with things like passwordless multi-factor authentication. How are you seeing something like passwordless multi-factor authentication help businesses both reduce their cyber risk in general, but then also speak to this FTC safeguards adaptation?
Yeah, there's multiple fronts, and everyone's touched on key components first, right? So the asset list, you can't secure what you don't know you don't have, right? And especially as a lot of organizations have now over the last 3 years moved to diversified workforces with work from anywhere, all of those things, multi-factor authentication becomes then more complex to implement, especially if you've got SaaS applications that someone spun up at your company that you don't know about, shadow SaaS, right? Because they had company credit card, went and got their own DocuSign account. So how are you moving towards being able to create, centralized identity management in those areas? But MFA across any one of the frameworks that's been discussed already seems to be a common theme. All right, it is table stakes these days to have. And, we set out to solve, our own personal frustrations with how much friction legacy MFA creates for people, right? So Forrest talked about people and processes, and unfortunately, we've seen this dismal low adoption rate of strong authentication, or what CISA is now recommending is phishing resistant MFA. And that's because most of the systems out there, we're adding layers upon layers upon layers of trying to build security through this layer cake approach, which really put the onus on the person, right? You had to then take all these extra steps. we can't speak to an MSP or a consultant like GreyCastle without them hearing, without us hearing stories of someone begging to turn the MFA off because it's created so much friction, right? And so we've set out to make it easier, not only for the person to use it, but where it's native at account creation. So it's not an afterthought, that it's just on when you get, onboarded to a company or registered to an account. It's there during recovery, and it's easier to use, but it's also, the unsung heroes in all of this are the admins and having to deploy this and enforce it. So how do we help the admins actually make their life better also?
Yeah, absolutely. I wish, I'm all aboard the MFA enabled by default, and like the disabled button, you have to dig to find it. You know what I mean? Like that's where I'm at. Dan, I wanted to throw it back to you. So this FTC safeguards, we teased it in the intro that automotive dealerships might be in scope, higher ed. Like who's in scope of all this? Like, if I'm watching this right now and I'm like, well, I don't think this applies to me. Like, how can I assess if it is in scope? And, is ignorance a defense? Can I be like, oh, I didn't realize, sorry.
Yeah, no, certainly ignorance is not a defense. And as others have said, this is as clear as mud to a lot of folks because there's all these if then maybes. I think the thing to remember here is the core is protecting consumer information. And what that means to the FTC is really any record containing non-public personal information that is about a customer of a financial institution. Great. So basically, if I'm looking to get a loan or a credit card from a retailer or credit of some sort, anything in that realm, it probably applies. I'm actually looking at a list of about 30 or 40 examples. And this is something I think we can follow up with folks on the call after and share. But it's everything from mortgage lenders and brokers to payday lenders to collection agencies to car dealerships. Even a business that might print and sell checks for a customer, a travel agency that has some sort of financing option. The list goes on and on and on. I'm sure the folks on this team here can share even more. You talked a little earlier how there's other institutions like higher ed, colleges and universities. Everyone goes, well, how does that work? Well, student aid. And this is where some of the confusion gets in because they're already required to comply with these rules under GLBA, which I think a lot of folks say, GLBA being the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act doesn't apply to us. What this FTC rule is saying is, well, these safeguards do apply to you, whether GLBA or some other governing regulation requires you to do this or not. So I think that's what's important to remember. If you're facilitating any sort of loan or collecting consumer information for any reason, look it up and check. It's likely that this FTC rule applies to you.
So a follow-up question for you, Dan, like Farley's question getting brought on stream right here. So as an online retailer, like a couple of things to qualify here. One is FTC safeguards apply based on revenue milestones. Does it matter on size of business? And does it matter if you've outsourced your, credit card processing to something like, a Square or one of these things?
So a lot of questions in there. Number one, size does matter here. So the legislation or the regulation is tiered based on your level or your revenue. And I'm going to have to follow up on this, but I believe it's $5 million. And if someone else on the panel knows for sure as being the major tier, if you're under that.
Within auto dealers, it's a number of loans processed per quarter, et cetera, not just dollar amount, but actually how many applications are you taking? There's other quantitative factors.
This is where it gets a little muddy, right?
Yep.
It depends on certain factors. So great point, Heath. And the other thing I'd say is this has changed from the previous requirements, and I think they've clarified it quite a bit. But my recommendation is go check on your specific type of organization. The FTC does make that pretty easy. That's something we can share with the group after the fact here as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. I love it.
So you also mentioned the qualified individual, and I just want to touch on that real quick. Mm-hmm. I think in the past, we've seen where organizations have kind of spread this out across different people to do different things. What they're looking for is a person to be appointed in your organization to run with this, basically own it, make sure that the requirements are met, and they have to have some level of capability commensurate with your level as an organization. Now, this is interesting because I think, if you're a large financial institution, there's going to be some very specific expectations around certifications, qualifications, knowledge, and experience. And as you tier down to smaller organizations, those expectations get lighter. So the FTC has given us some leeway here in what those expectations are. That being said, they do expect that person to have knowledge and understanding of what's being asked and how to apply that, which that can be a challenge for some folks. So real quick, last point, that can actually be a third party that's called out specifically here. You can work with someone that's an expert in the industry to help you get through this stuff.
Oh, that is interesting. That's a business right there. So Forrest, I want to throw it to you because we just talked about, qualified individuals and Dan did a great job of defining that. Let's take it a step further and help people in chat right now. How can leaders build organizational credibility internally with the C-suite and stakeholders regarding this type of activity?
Yeah, so oftentimes going through the cyber insurance process or even the professional liability process at large, we often run into situations where the risk manager or folks in the CFO suite aren't quite as aware as what's happening on the IT side and vice versa, right? And so really where this can be a wedge point is for IT leaders and risk managers to really come together and get under the same banner and kind of build out the best practices and plan around this. Because I think one thing that is important to note, and Heath has heard me say this multiple times, but it's that hurricanes may be getting stronger, tornadoes may be getting more severe, but they're not learning from the previous natural disaster on how to attack you. And so within this, I think it is having an active, plan in place, but also something that can evolve and grow to where the leaders, the designated leaders that are responsible for this, can actually take charge and implement this under the guise of these are organizational best practices. Oh, by the way, it's also being mandated, right? And so the cultural shift around this to really drive behavior change, it does start at the top. Like the adoption and the implementation or just the use of MFA, it requires buy-in from leadership. And I'll tell you that like oftentimes there's the stigma of, oh, it's so-and-so in accounting who clicks on a cat video. Oftentimes the social engineering is coming from the CFO who thinks it's a trusted email and it's not, and then 300 grand goes out the door. And so I'd like to just kind of open it up because Chad had alluded to some best practices and cross-organizational solutions around this, but I think it really is that calling card for organizations to use this as a way to really kind of show their leadership in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Chad, can you comment on the cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals that CISA has been promoting and how recommended best practices might be simplifying or making things more overwhelming?
Yeah, for sure. One thing I used to, just speaking to a lot of people, and I would always start back and they're like, hey, are you using some kind of framework? Quite often they're not. I think the key is to use a framework. Some are more user-friendly, I'll call it, than others, especially like the NIST cybersecurity framework is, I believe it's much more user-friendly, right? For those that don't have a cyber IT background, senior leadership, they can take these things, even though they don't really have that technical background and they can understand it more. But what was all generally missing is, okay, great, I've got this framework, but where in the world do I start? It really doesn't tell me, what should I do? What's going to make the biggest impacts? Am I just going to pick something out of the framework and go with that? Well, that may not be, reducing our risk in the most manageable way. So I think the checklists are key, especially for organizations that are much less cyber mature. They can take that checklist like we've got, and they can look at it, and it's broken up by what's going to make the biggest impact. So they can go through there and they can see, for instance, and I'm just kind of looking at it off screen here, like we talked about, the asset inventory. It's got a medium cost, but it's going to have one of the biggest impacts. The complexity of going through that is medium. And then there's, in these checklists, there's links for, well, how do I really go about doing this particular domain? asset inventory. So there's references where you can start looking at, okay, here's the kinds of tools. These are the things people need to understand. So that checklist is key, because you don't have to say, we have no idea where to start. With a checklist, you can start somewhere. While some make a bigger impact than others, you've got that checklist, and even if you're not picking the one necessarily that's got the biggest impact, it's absolutely gonna have an impact. You start there and you start working to that checklist, because that makes it much less overwhelming, because now I know what to do. And then over a period of time, as your cyber program becomes mature, people are learning, you've gone through this checklist, you've got this baseline. Now you can start reaching out, figuring, okay, how do we advance? How do we move to a more mature organization than we've got now? But I think that checklist is key, because it absolutely gives you a place to start. Just because you finish that checklist, that's not the end goal, right? That's just setting up that baseline for you. But I believe it makes it so much less overwhelming when you've got that piece of paper in front of you that you can go through. You can talk with all those involved and figure out, hey, here's what we've got. Let's prioritize. Let's figure out what's going to make the biggest impact related to our budget, related to, not just our financial resources, but the people we have. And then you go forward, and it's just taking those steps, constantly moving forward.
Yeah, maximum compliance equals minimum security. It's not the end goal, but it's a good start. But you actually brought up a really interesting point near the end there, Chad, about financial resources and implementing the entire checklist or implementing best practices. That's awesome, and that's the goal. But those things do cost money. They do cost time. They do cost resources. Heath, I want to ask you, how can we use best practices to kind of convince to show the business side of the house, the cash money, the value of what we're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And, so I think there's a couple points there, and the best practices are, recommended, within the frameworks that Chad was mentioning, right? You identify there. And I think in today's technology world, it's pretty simple to go start doing some homework on your own and identifying, where is my most risk, right? And I think you'll quickly identify that your business email and access to your business email is probably the number one path that a bad actor, whether it's through phishing, social engineering, someone using their business email for personal use, and they've got the same password on multiple accounts, et cetera. But starting somewhere like that, I think the stats are over 80% are credential based through business email. And looking at ROI on the business side of it, implementing strong MFA on the key assets, and Forrest can take over, and Dan can take over on this, but will deliver you a better rate on your insurance as one way to look at ROI. And how do you offset well, there's a cost to implementing strong MFA, yes, but can it reduce your cyber insurance? Absolutely. Or can it even qualify you to get a policy? Absolutely. There's places where if you don't have it, they won't insure you. If we look at other industries that we all understand, whether it's our home or auto, those have a long history of, if you do these things, like your home, defensible space for fire protection reduces your insurance. If a inspector comes out and says you haven't done anything, you could lose your insurance, right? So in your car, if you've got teenagers now, there's modern technology, modern solutions where you can stick a tracker in the car and get a better insurance rate, right? So simple things like that drive ROI on those things that we all understand. Well, you can actually do that for your cyber practice. And earlier, I think Chad mentioned it, and Dan might have mentioned it. There's a lot of SMBs that just get overwhelmed and don't understand, or think that they can't afford to do it. But what they also need to understand is those thresholds for the regulation, right? So may not apply to them. However, 60% of them fail when they have an incident, right? So are you willing to take a greater than a coin flip chance of not being in business if you don't take some of this serious, right? And that's an ROI, right? Staying in business is an ROI. And so, and we believe that MFA on the key things is a great place to start. And I think I can get backed up by every other expert here because it's really mapped in everything there. So how do you do that effectively? You can also get ROI on reducing support tickets, right? The average cost of a password reset is $70 according to Forrester and other research institutes, right? So how many of those a month are you having? Well, there's other data that says any organization has 30 to 50% of their people have a support ticket on any given month, and 30 to 50% of those are directly related to a password reset. What's that costing you? Let's fix that.
Yeah, and if you're looking for, like, if you think Heath is just, pontificating or spitting hypotheticals, the Allergy Partners Clinic in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, just last week had a ransomware incident and immediately shut their doors. People found out when they went to go get their shots that morning that they weren't in business anymore. So this is a real thing that can have catastrophic impact, not just for business, but for the community that depends on that business.
Absolutely. On the other side, on a more like consumer side, like just 2 days ago, DraftKings announced they got hacked and an 18-year-old's responsible for it, right? Like, it's every type of business. Like this world doesn't care whether you're, located in the central part of the country in a small business. They don't care. Like you're connected to the web, they're going to find you and get you.
Yeah. So Dan, let me ask you a question, because we are seasoned practitioners, and there might be some InfoSec folks in chat. What's up, InfoSec community? But there's also other people who are learning just to get experience and understand what they need to know about this FTC safeguards. So let's take a step back. And we have been saying risk, cyber risk, this risk, that. Let's define, or I'd ask you, Dan, please define risk within the context of information security so people can wrap their head around exactly what we're talking about.
So, yeah, I can give you the cheesy answer. It's a simple equation. It's vulnerability times impact, but this is actually the best way to think about it. There's a couple of gotchas in here that I love to talk and educate about, though. So what is risk, right? As soon as we do anything with an information system, we have risk. Like, it could break. That's a risk, and I can't do it. Or we could get ransomed. That's a risk. And there's all kinds of different levels of risk in between there. The thing that's important for me, and I think for other practitioners, is this isn't an IT function, right? Risk inherently belongs to the business. Now, while a lot of the issues may start, the vulnerabilities may start in an information system in IT, the impacts are to the business. So when we get in a room and we use, one of Chad's checklists to go through and say, hey, do you have an asset inventory? And are you doing vulnerability management? All these things, that everyone would rather not do. We can talk about all the vulnerabilities that could cause a problem with one or more of your systems. So you used a great example of that organization closing their doors, and I'm assuming they just couldn't get to any of their information anymore. If I came into a room with the risk owners, the senior execs, and said, hey, we've identified 3 vulnerabilities that could shut down this system, and that system. What does that mean to you? Because I don't know. And they say, oh, well, that system's just, for marketing. And if that went down, no big deal. But this system here generates us 50% of our revenue. If that goes down, we lose X dollars per day, per week. Now, me in information security or in IT, I can't tell you what that impact is. The business, the folks that own and run the business can. So our job as information security practitioners is to bring those two views together in a simple to understand way. I don't need to know the 3-letter acronyms and technical mumbo jumbo about why the vulnerability exists. Tell me what happens if that gets exploited. And then the folks in the business, they'll tell us what the impact is. And putting those two together lets us calculate risk. And that prioritizes our work. So I've simplified it, but I can tell you from experience, we often are missing the second half of that equation. The business representation is nowhere to be found. Therefore, we're not really doing a good risk assessment. Therefore, we can't prioritize what we have to do and why. I think it's a great thing to segue, though, here and say, with the insurance companies really trying to figure this out, how do they provide good coverage for the right cost? They've really started to learn what are those top issues? What are the things that organizations probably have significant risk factors in, so they can really kickstart the process? And I'm wondering, if anyone on the panel wants to talk about that.
Yeah. So I really do like the idea of, Chad's kind of point on where to start is around, picking an item off the checklist, but also understanding what your organization does and what the impact could be is kind of where we go for quantifying risk. And so it's not just the regulatory exposure, but it's also the downtime. So a couple quick claims examples. Coalition paid a claim. Coalition is an insurtech, very strong cyber carrier. They paid one of the first property damage claims on a manufacturing line. And it wasn't because the, chips were nuked or anything like that. It was because the seals for the oil piston bearings had basically dehydrated because the machines weren't running around the clock. And it bricked essentially the machinery where the machinery had to be replaced. Conversely, other large carriers were on, say, the city of Atlanta, when the city of Atlanta was held ransom. These are things that there is a real downtime and impact there, kind of to your point, Jerry, around the kind of broader community impact. And so I see a question here. What's the one thing to do now to be compliant? It would be to assess how long you will be down and what that impact looks like and to whom it will be impactful for. Because, if you are a parts manufacturer for an OEM, some of the OEMs are finding their manufacturers $1,000 a minute that product is late to the line due to just-in-time manufacturing. And so quantifying that is around you really looking at your business and knowing it. And my final piece here is around no one is going to be a bigger advocate for your organization than you. We may all have a concern or a vested interest in that business, but if it's your business, you have to advocate the controls and measures that you are putting in place. To Heath's point, there are carriers out there that if you don't have these baseline measures in place, they will not even provide a quote of insurance. Other carriers are more lenient. They will provide a pathway. So if you can show that you are in the process of implementing MFA, they will give a little bit more guidance. But it takes you telling the story of your business and the things that you are doing to secure your operations that makes the insurance folks more comfortable, to show that you have an understanding of, okay, well, we're still running a SAN network from the early 90s that has to be, fenced and made sure that it never goes offline. Well, that's a risk. And so knowing your business is really step one to understanding what you must be compliant for. Kind of to the point around transactional volume, it might not be just a sheer revenue number. It could be loans processed or transactions processed and the information that you're handling. So within all of this, I think it's really important to know your best story as an organization, know who your partners are, because the people around this table, virtual table, will all tell you that, everyone that they work with at the organization needs to be kind of at that decision-making table, because when things go sideways, it's not just the IT guy's mandate. It is everyone's mandate to take best practices. So that kind of closing notes on the insurance industry as a whole, like there has been a drastic change in how they've looked at this. 10 years ago, it was a throw-in coverage. It was, okay, you want cyber? Here's your 5 questions. That had a different impact on the underwriting appetite, as we've seen, and the losses that have been taken. But the reason why the applications are getting longer is because the carriers have seen that if you're not using MFA or if you're not doing things like backing up your data, that ransomware loss ticks up really, really quickly because it's not just, trying to get the keys back, it's the recovery from that. And so I guess my piece of advice is don't be the company that's trying to wait for 7 to 10 business days to convert their money into crypto to try and pay a ransom. Like, have a game plan in place going into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Google Zurich, not Petya, if you want more information on why that's the case.
Exactly.
into Dan's point too, like Dan and Forrest together, there's a lot of great information coming out right here. Basically, you need to be able to speak to the business, which if you boil it all the way down is money. That's the language of the business. And the insurance company, when they're ratcheting rates up or premiums because your cyber security posture is not good, that is a great lever to pull in order to basically get budget and get momentum on your cyber program. Now, one thing that doesn't really take a lot of budget, but would be useful is some of the great resources that CISA has. Chad, I wanted to ask you, because I personally use CISA's resources like a lot, but can you kind of share with the audience some of the resources that CISA has that would be totally applicable to helping these programs implement best practices?
Yeah, absolutely. So I probably should have mentioned this earlier. Everything we do is no cost. It's all federally funded, because people ask me, they're like, well, what would it cost to have this done? Well, just your time. There's going to be a cost there, but it's all free. It's all federally funded. It's already been paid for through your tax dollars. A big thing that we do is a number of assessments. And touching on both what Forrest and Dan just mentioned, when Forrest talked about knowing your business, a lot of our assessments will focus on a critical service. So, sure, maybe your emails go down. Yeah, that can be bad, right? But that's probably not going to run you out of business. But when Dan mentioned that healthcare organization going out of business, that critical service that we're going to assess is going to, what if that service went down? How is that going to stop you from accomplishing your mission? Where Dan mentioned, the healthcare organization. Well, that ransomware absolutely stopped the organizational mission of treating patients, right? So if we were looking at a healthcare organization and those doctors can no longer get to those digital records of the patients that come in, well, they can't look at their history, and they may decide to prescribe them a particular medicine that if they had that history, they can say, well, we cannot write this prescription to you, right? This would be really bad, potentially side effects because of your history, or things that you're allergic to, maybe things that the patient would not necessarily, that would forget to tell them. So everything we do is no cost. I'll mention on our website, we have a tool called CSET. It houses many of the assessments that we have. Anybody can download those. We generally self-facilitate those, but organizations can do it themselves. And they do. They're all question and answer based. We're not, you don't have to be technical. You're not scanning networks to answer these questions. It's going to be simple. For instance, we ask, are you using multi-factor authentication related to this critical service? You're either going to answer yes, we do it, no, we're not doing it, or we have it in certain places. So they're all question and answer based. Each of the questions provide some guidance to help understand, well, what does this question really mean? So I would say definitely check out CISA's site. We've got links to lots of different types of training. The assessments are key because, different, where we've got some that focus on, your vulnerability management, or they're going to focus on your controls, or even third parties, right? Everybody works with third parties today. We've got one that's strictly focused on that third party risk management, supply chain risk management. How are you managing that throughout the life cycle? So I would encourage people to just go through our website, look and see what resources we've got. Every state has at least one cybersecurity advisor. I'm in Arkansas, we have two. And go on the website and look for your region, reach out to them, and they'll tell you who the contact is in your state. Then you can start having those conversations. I wouldn't say, do this assessment first, because without having that conversation with that organization, so we can help determine what's going to have the biggest impact to you. So go to our site, find out what region you're in. There'll be a phone number, there'll be an email, reach out to them and just get that contact in your state and start that conversation. They'll come out, they'll talk to you, they'll go over all the different resources we've got, and then together you can figure out what's going to make the biggest impact for your organization.
Absolutely. And a word of caution, don't answer that assessment with rose-colored glasses on. Be fair, be objective, because it doesn't do you any good. It doesn't do you any good to not be honest with yourself. We're almost at time. I want to throw it to Heath for final thoughts. Heath, great discussion today. What are your kind of takeaway final thoughts for the audience?
Yeah, great discussion. We could talk for a lot longer, right, and go on, but I know we're all busy. So awesome to have everybody here today. Final thoughts are, if you need help with these things, like Chad just said, reach out. There's free resources there at CISA. If you need guidance to get through those, find an expert like Dan and his team at GreyCastle. Forrest and his team at Brightline Insurance are also experts that will guide you through the process. We'll help you. Both of those organizations have chosen to partner with us as for MFA provider to help be one of those technologies that you can implement to make change in that and deliver that ROI. But find some help if you need it. Get an MSP if you don't have one, whatever that means for your size organization today, and start doing your homework. It does. People still have this mindset of, it's not real world, it's digital world, and it doesn't have a real world impact. And that's just simply, based on your show, Simply Cyber, right, Gerald, is that that's simply not true. All of these things are affecting this healthcare clinic couldn't provide, allergy shots. That's real world, right? And they don't think that it really has an impact, and it does. And we all need to be taking it seriously and teaching even the next generation, I know we're out of time, but quick example of social media accounts that people have created a job out of being an influencer, and they don't put MFA on their social media account. Someone gets account takeover, everything that they built, and that influencer business is gone, right? And that's just a simple example of real world impact. So go get some help and reach out. We're all here to help.
Yeah, and if you want a real example of that, Google Linus Tech Tips just happened to him, 15 million sub account. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you again to everyone for joining the discussion. Thank you to our wonderful esteemed panelists for all of their knowledge and sharing. It was really awesome. If you want to follow up, you have additional questions, you want to keep the conversation going, reach out to us on LinkedIn. Our names are right there. I'm sure none of us are using shadow accounts or anything like that. And feel free to share on your socials this conversation, because it will be recorded and available on replay. I'm Jerry. On behalf of all the panelists, thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next episode of Ready, Set, Cyber.